Wonderful. And my headphones work. Man, what a pleasure it is having technology.
All right, beautiful. I'm going to go start the YouTube.
Perfect. Got the lovely Miss Hod Pro, Awesome Egg, a lot of good people in here. Good to see everybody.
Technology. All right, beautiful. Can we hear it on YouTube? Everybody good out there?
Check, check. Mic 1, 2. Did you get it all fired up? We looking good?
All right, we're looking good. I think we're all good on YouTube. And yeah, I think we're good. Just looking for our other guest to show up.
No, it's all good. We'll go ahead. Let's go ahead and fire the bad boy up, and we'll get Gamma in here when he's ready.
All right, sounds good. All right, I'd like to officially welcome all of you to Liquid Lunch, powered by Liquid Loans. Liquid Loans is a decentralized borrowing protocol launching on Pulse Chain with 0% interest, no repayment schedule, no admin keys, no governance, and is 100% immutable. It is truly true DeFi. For those of you who don't know, I am HEXiCAT. I'll be your host for today. I'm part of the Liquid Loans team and host the HEXiCAT Chats podcast, which I highly recommend you go check out on all major podcasting platforms. I'd also like to encourage everyone to go like and share the Spaces tweet so we can get as many people in here as possible and as much engagement as possible. Just to let everybody know, we're dual streaming this live on the Liquid Loans YouTube channel. For those not able to join on Twitter, feel free to hop over there where you can comment and ask questions if you're not able to raise your hand and speak on Twitter. Our guest speakers today include leading crypto blockchain expert and global head of growth and partnerships at Liquid Loans, WaLLrus. It's an honor to have him here live again with us on Liquid Lunch. Alongside WaLLrus, we have a prominent technical expert who will be joining us, who many of you know from his time in the as an admin in the Pulse Chain Telegram group, Gamma. Many thanks for him for taking time out of his busy schedule to share his knowledge and hop on here. So the real reason we're here is because of mining and privacy issues. So what is data mining? Data mining, for those that don't know, is the process of uncovering patterns and other valuable information from large data sets. Organizations then use this to predict our behaviors and patterns. So they can market to us better, they can provide credit reporting, things like that. Those are advantages of it. But there's also a lot of disadvantages like privacy issues, security issues with your social security numbers, birthdays, information that can be misused or inaccurate information. So WaLLrus, why don't you let us know how we came about getting to this point and why this is such a big thing right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So luckily we got Gamma in here already, so it's good to see you, brother. So data mining is always been an issue, right? Like most of us are familiar with it, especially from like the social media platforms, Meta, Google. You know, we're very aware of a lot of the, the infringements on privacy that go along in that realm. Where and we've seen that basically historically, every time they start doing data mining, it always starts with maybe something innocuous, relatively small, and then it scales up, and it scales up, and then they lose the data and the data gets breached. It happens over and over and over. So from the data mining aspect, there's a couple of things that are particularly worrisome. One is that it almost inevitably expands on what it is that's actually being extracted. And then two, it always ends up getting leaked, right? In the space, we've already seen a minor touch of this with Ledger, where some of their purchasing stuff was listed. Now that didn't actually dox anyone's wallets or addresses, but it did leak out all their email addresses and mailing addresses and a few different things. So we've already seen it sort of touch the space. The present issue that really started was actually with Uniswap. So on the 11th, they put up a blurb on their blog saying, Uniswap's commitment to privacy. And I particularly have an issue with some of this language because, again, this is what we see in the space where it starts with very, very warm feeling language. Here's how we're protecting you. Oh my goodness, we would never do anything. One of the lines in here is that Web3 aims to reclaim user privacy and choice after decades of internet businesses that have eroded it. And I agree with that, which is why I don't really agree with how they go on to basically say that they're collecting off-chain data. So they put this out on November 11th. And this is something that this particular blurb had been, this blog post had been requoted by and tweeted by like Hayden and a few of the other like founders and really big hitters in the Uniswap. Where it became a problem was that on the 17th, they actually updated their privacy policy, didn't put up a blog post, and the blog post itself does have a link to the privacy policy, but again, it changed on the 17th. And once you actually go through, there's a very different set of language used in a lot of ways. So the few that really stuck out to me is that one, it's off-chain data, right? That's very different. So anything you put on chain, you should always assume that that's going to be used and aggregated in interesting ways. Off-chain data is different, right? Like this opens us up for doxing risks. It means that we're showing more than we would likely want to be correlated and aggregated against our on-chain data. And then when you actually look at some of the specific language, one is they say we do not share your information with third parties for any marketing purposes. And you're like, okay, well, that makes me feel a little better. But then when you look under where they will share your data, under business changes, they list off, this is the exact language here this is from their privacy policy. We may transfer or share data to another entity in the event of a merger, acquisition, bankruptcy, dissolution, reorganization. All those are relatively unlikely, probably not very concerning. But then asset or stock sale or other business transaction. Well, other business transaction basically means anything, right? Like that's the issue with a lot of these things is they end up giving you things that you think of that make sense, that are logical sort of starting points, and then they give themselves an out on that language. Then they have the other that was concerning to me is that they have to comply with legal obligations. So when it comes to a lot of these things, if they're American companies or wherever it is, regardless, they should always comply with the obligations, right? That's stuff that we need to understand as users, is that if we don't like that level of compliance, or we need to figure out how we need to address that compliance to be private for ourselves, that's fine, right? That's an acceptable thing. We don't want companies doing illegal things. That just gives the big brother a reason to come down and crack down, right? So they have their section on legal obligation. That's fine. But then separately from that, they add in areas where there's another one under safety and security, where they say that they'll share the data to protect against, investigate, stop fraudulent, unauthorized, or illegal activity. And it goes on, a few more things from there. Well, that's a separate section away from compliance. So that to me says that they're doing things, again, above compliance, above doing whatever it is they absolutely should do with whatever law enforcement agencies, to look at their own use case, their own policies, and investigate some of these things. And that I have a concern with, right? This is in Uniswap. Uniswap's a cornerstone, right? So Uniswap, and this is something that, again, we'll address here shortly, and this is something that Gamma has a really good take on. When we say Uniswap, we sort of think of it as one thing. Uniswap is three different things. There's Uniswap, the code, which is what we see on chain. That's the actual DEX. This is what's been forked and used for all kinds of other great projects. It's as good as it gets when it comes to these things, right? So most of us are so used to having DEXs and things like Uniswap, we don't even remember what it was like beforehand. Like we almost forget that you had to use exchanges and OTC and the local Bitcoin, all these things. We've almost completely erased that from our brains, and we're so used to just having DEXs where we make these swaps in seconds. Then there's Uniswap, the front end, and their front end is what does this data collection. So you can actually do some things that we'll get into shortly, where you can use different front ends and different ways to interact directly with the contract. But the Uniswap front end is different than Uniswap, the code that's on chain. And then you have Uniswap Labs, which is the company. And that company is in New York, and it has all the same jurisdiction and regulations that any other company would have doing software inside of New York. So Uniswap is three different things, and this is the way it is with most of DeFi spaces. So the Uniswap code is still fantastic. It's a cornerstone. Everything about it's wonderful. There's V2 and V3. They add feature sets. There's great stuff here, right? That's different than the front end that's doing this data collection, and it's different than, in my opinion, the company, which is going above compliance, right? And that's where I have issues, is that they put out a blog post with nice, clean language that makes you feel good, and then the privacy policy is updated 6 days later with holes that would allow them to share different kinds of information. The other big one that came up is Metamask, and I'm just setting some context. We're going to get into more stuff. I just want to make sure that we understand specifically why this data collection is a problem and why so many of us are concerned. So Metamask, which is owned by Consensus, which also owns Infura, these guys run a large section of that space, right? Like a lot of the RPC, which is what WaLLrus used to actually communicate with the blockchains. A lot of this is controlled by Infura. Infura is kind of the standard. So they put out an update to their privacy policy on the 23rd, and it goes on to basically list out some of the things that they're collecting, including IP addresses. And IP addresses can be used in a variety of ways that, you know, bigger agencies can go through and docs. And that's the big concern here, right? Is that taking off-chain data and allowing these companies to either, one, overmine what they say, which is a concern in a lot of ways, to lose the data, which happens time and time and time again, or again, that it's easy for these guys to be subpoenaed and go above and beyond, or work closely with other agencies, as we've seen a lot of these social media sites do, for a variety of reasons, whether it comes down to allowing them to be overly aggressive in prosecutions, whether it allows them to censor, which we've seen Infura do in the past when it comes to some of the geopolitical issues like in Ukraine. So there's real concerns here. And I think fundamentally, and I'm about to hand it over to Gamma to see if he has a take on some of this as well. I'm just trying to set the stage. Sort of the issues that we have here are that we already know the level of sort of oversight and authoritarian push that we've seen across the world. A lot of that is the reason and ethos for why we got into DeFi. We didn't want DeFi to be more like TradFi. We wanted DeFi to be less like TradFi. We wanted it to be its own thing. We wanted to retain privacy, retain rights, which is what Uniswap wrote in their blog post before changing the privacy policy. The other is that these things inevitably go farther. And then I think the third is that when you see companies like Metamask, like Uniswap, that most of us would point to as, you know, blue chip examples for DeFi, and now that they're going farther, that feels more like a betrayal. So I think that there's the tangible risk issue of what they're doing with the data, what will happen with that data when they store it, and then a little bit of, again, like this is really against the ethos of what a lot of us, you know, believe in. So Dan Finlay, who's the founder of MetaMask, now I think his title's changed a little bit as, you know, these companies start to layer. Something that he said that I also thought was particularly bothersome was, I think this is something he tweeted here referring to Infura taking IP addresses and storing them. He said, I think we can get this fixed soon. So he acknowledges this is a problem. We are not using IP addresses, even if they are being temporarily stored, which they don't need to be, as we're not using them for anything. So you acknowledge it's a problem. You're saying they're temporarily stored and that you're not using them. That's a very disconnected paragraph there and a very disconnected viewpoint. So if you think it's a problem, why are they being stored at all? If they're being stored, why are they only being stored temporarily? And if they're being stored temporarily and you don't need them, like sort of like what's really going on here?
I can speak to that. It's a
absolutely.
technical thing. It's a okay. So the internet is comprised of IP addresses, like everybody's got one. An RPC, like Infura, will get your IP address because you are connecting your MetaMask, whether you're using your phone, whether you're using your computer, doesn't matter. You are connecting to their server through, you know, the remote procedure call, RPC. Well, that connection is through a reverse proxy. It could be Apache, it could be Nginx, doesn't matter. Well, they're going to get your IP address because that those reverse proxies, they're like the same programs that run like basically every website that's on the internet. It's going to be either probably Apache or it's going to be Nginx. So they're using the fundamental technologies that like basically power the web. So they're going to have your IP address. So he says that because he understands the technology. He basically built the thing. So he understands from a technological standpoint, the IP address, when you connect to it, is stored in like a log that is probably deleted like every day. I run a RPC. By default, that information is like taken by the server so that it can function. But like when I run an RPC, I mean, I don't do anything with that information either, which is exactly what he said. So you get the IP address. When you send a transaction over the RPC to the mempool so that it can be broadcast and put into a block, then part of that transaction is your Ethereum address with all the, you know, all the other parts that you need to have a valid transaction. So you have an IP address and you have Ethereum address that's connected. The problem is, like, do they do anything with that information? Do they actually store it, or do they just automatically delete it, every day? So a normal Linux server, because they're going to be totally running Linux. Literally, when you install Linux, the log files are there because you have to troubleshoot like issues. So they're by default created, and then they're automatically deleted by the system, and they're just they're rolling, right? You'll have the current one for the day, and then you'll have like maybe one other log file that's like from yesterday, and then eventually like that'll be deleted like automatically by the system, and then it's like a rolling period. So they have to get your IP address. Every website that's on the internet gets your IP address when you connect to it by default. The thing that's most concerning with them collecting it, like if they were going to do anything with it, i.e., actually, like, say, have run a script that would scrape the IP address and the Ethereum address and put it into an Excel document, right? Like, that's very, very, very concerning. What he says is, like, they're not doing that. The servers are collecting the IP addresses. The servers are, basically have the Ethereum address because that's part of sending a transaction. They have to get that information. Do they delete it, as a normal course of business? It sounds like that's what they're doing. But technically, they have to get your IP address. Otherwise, the internet would break down. And then they have to have your Ethereum address because that's part of the transactions. So his statement makes a total sense from like an understanding of the underlying technologies. So I just wanted to clarify, that piece anyway.
So Gamma,
See,
thanks
and
for
that's
all those
exactly why you're
insights.
here.
Yeah, thank you for all those insights. We really appreciate it. My question is, and everybody else here is just not nearly as technical as you and maybe WaLLrus. What are our options when it comes to this and these invasions of our privacy and collecting the IP addresses? What can we do to like stop it or?
Sure. So here's the couple stack, right? WaLLrus is talking about the full stack of, right, you have a website and you have a front end and you have a back end and you have the Nginx or Apache, which is basically serves the websites and makes the internet function. And then you have with an RPC, you have a piece of that, and then you also have the client, which is the database, the blockchain database, and all these pieces kind of work together, right? Well, if you are in your house and you're just using it, then your internet service provider gives you an IP address that's kind of randomly assigned to you, right? And then if you go to any website, then that website will see that your IP address. Google website, Netflix, any service that's on the internet will get your IP address, and it's the one that's generally assigned to you by your ISP. And it's called an external IP address, and it's whatever. We don't have to go into technicals. We're not going there. But I'm just saying you have an IP address. Everybody does, and it's assigned to you by your ISP. And if you go to MetaMask will see that IP address, and so the RPC will see that IP address. The same like if you went to Netflix, or same if you went to Google. So what you could do is you could get a VPN provider. You can pay for a service, NordVPN, Proton VPN. I mean, there's like 5 or 6 of them, like the major ones. Those work, but the problem I have with those is they're collective exit IP servers, right? So you connect to their server, and then so all the internet traffic that you're broadcasting to the world is showing you from, say, one of their servers. So now you are collectively being logged everywhere as coming from this server. The problem, like generally speaking, that's not a problem. But if you are using a VPN and you are going through MetaMask and you are using Infura and whatever, and your IP address is connected to your Ethereum address because you did a transaction. Now your Ethereum address is connected to an IP address that's kind of collective. And so are there any bad actors using that VPN service? Is your Ethereum address now tied to a bad actor that's using this service now? And like, are you going to have secondary repercussions because you were using a VPN service with, say, I mean, it's not really a dirty IP, but I'm saying it's a commingled IP. So like the problem I have with using a VPN service like company and then trying to hide my IP address when I'm doing Ethereum transactions with one of those big box providers is like, I don't know who else is on the network. And I don't know if some 3-letter organization is going to get hold of this list. And now they're going to blacklist me, my Ethereum address that I didn't do anything wrong. I just used Uniswap, say, you know what I mean? I just swapped, I bought some SHIB or something. And then because I was using this VPN service, now they're just like, now I'm blacklisted. Now my Ethereum address has a black mark because somebody else was doing something. And they're like, well, maybe my Ethereum address is tied back to this bad actor that was using this VPN. Like, this is like kind of the worst case scenario thinking, but I was kind of in the army, so I kind of think worst case anyway. And I'm technical, and I'm thinking, okay, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen using a VPN? Well, this is kind of the worst thing. So to get around that, you can run your own VPN. You can get your own server that's in some data center somewhere, but then that IP is still going to be back tied to you. So if you got
can I jump in there with you, Gamma?
Yes.
Okay, so on the blast listing there, like this, what you're kind of discussing there is that there's a common aspect between all these people using something like a VPN, where now you sort of join in on that blast listing. That's something similar to like what we saw, like possibly with Tornado Cash, right? Where there was this issue where they went and put sanctions on the Tornado Cash contract. And then we saw like those, like certain blacklisted addresses, like send that Tornado Cash to like all these like famous addresses. And then there's this big spiraling issue of like, okay, who's actually on this blacklist, who's not, what is going on there? Like that's your concern there with some kind of commonality, like a VPN service, right?
Yeah. I'm not saying that would happen. I'm just saying if you're using a common IP address from like tens of thousands of other people, what are the tens of thousands of other people that are using this IP address, or say a block of IP addresses is more likely. So that's my concern with getting your Ethereum address tied to you. So like for you, it probably would have been better just to have it tied back to your IP address that was given to you by your ISP, and then now you're like, right, your Ethereum address is tied to your IP, but it's not commingled with a bunch of other people. So that's my concern with using a big box VPN. But what I was going to say is you can get around that. You can mask your personal IP address, the one that's given to your ISP that's logged to your like address, by simply creating a VPN with an open source software to a server it could be overseas, it could be in Chicago, whatever. And then now you're not giving up your IP address to your house, but you're still giving up an IP address in the country that is, I mean, like if the government wanted to track you down, they still could. But now you're not commingling your IP address. Like that's still your IP address. But it's an IP address that's say in AWS data center or a DigitalOcean data center. And now you've just basically delegated your IP address to some other server that's not in your house. It depends on it depends on how far down the rabbit hole you really want to go, because it's incredibly difficult to completely mask your IP address. Like unless you're trying to be a bad actor, right? And then you can use Bitcoin and you can have a service that's not tied to you, and you can go through all these hoops. But if you're just trying to not have your IP address at your house that you use because you're afraid that some third party company is gonna take that information, or maybe they're gonna I don't know, do something bad with it. I don't know. There's a bunch of bad things that can happen. But especially
Okay.
good things can happen.
So
I'm just saying. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know All that is awesome for sure. And like the super geeks are going to do all that VPN stuff. And then I'm going to do it a way where I'm going to keep hopping all, you're never going to find certain people. You're just never, but everyone on the call, like there's not a lot of those people out there. So I think we really have to trust these apps that we use. Like if, whoever's creating these applications in the, Pulse chain and Hex ecosystem, and it's not always malice, but we have to trust that they're like not writing logs to disk. Like I think you can kind of sum it up is, are they persisting IP addresses to disk? And like that means either a log file or a database. And if they're not doing both of those, your IP address is just in memory for a while and then it's in and out of the computer. When you hit the little computer with your IP address, it has to be in memory, whatever, and it goes away. And it's really as simple as that. Like, are these application providers, these developers, all these services we SAC for, did they go through the care of like making sure the log files they're writing this don't have this information? Are they taking care that they're not, persisting to the database? Are they using like an open source authentication thing that automatically, by default writes to logs in database and they didn't do the extra work to take it out? Like that is key, because then if, that application doesn't have your IP, all these other mitigating factors of VPN and hiding your IP go away to a good extent. There's always exceptions, but, I think at the bare minimum, we should like challenge all the people building in the ecosystem to not hold this information, even if it's there by default, even if it takes a couple weeks of dev hours to do it. Make sure there are no IPs in the logs, no IPs in the database.
Yeah, I mean,
Thanks.
and so like I was saying before, a while ago, it was like by the default Linux stores these IP addresses, like in Nginx, it stores them, but then it automatically deletes them over, like a day or whatever. There's a cron job that rotates the logs because it doesn't want to build up a bunch of logs in the memory. And as long as they're not like have a script running where they're scraping that data and then putting it to another place, then the problem we have with say MetaMask or even these RPC services are the same concern that we would have basically with any website on the entire internet. It's basically the same. I don't personally worry about it too much. I know all the details and everything, but generally speaking, I don't really worry about it like that much, even though I did kind of go down the rabbit hole there a little bit. You know what
Thanks,
I mean?
Gamma. And thanks, Hex Live, for your question and your comments. We appreciate it. WaLLrus, do you want to turn this back to you? And I would like to get your take on it. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and like I said, that's kind of why I want to set the stage a little bit, is that we know these things are sort of out of control. They're very difficult to really measure and really keep tabs on, right? Like, to Hex Live's point, most of us are understanding and basically just nodding our head along with some of the tech, because again, both these guys get farther down the rabbit hole than I go. So I guess I kind of wanted to bring it back to most of us with Gamma and just, okay, so do you think that what we've seen specifically written, obviously we're not sure what they're doing, we're just going over their policies. Do you think that there's reasons for concern with what we're seeing from Infura and Uniswap? Do you think that it's just a concern that there's off-chain data, this is something to monitor, or do you think that this is something that we should act upon? I know you've talked about running your own nodes and a few things. We can get into the tech side, but just at sort of a layman's level, do you see something specifically that's an issue here, or is this something to monitor?
I mean, I'm just monitoring it honestly because the majority of people are not going to run their own RPC services. If you are a company in the US, you have requirements from the government to, store certain information. So unless you're going to run a full node like on your own desktop, which is totally recommended, totally do it. It's awesome if you're kind of geeky. You're going to have that data leakage a little bit. Now, I mean, understanding privacy policies are important. So like it just depends on how far down the rabbit hole you really want to go. Decentralization is great. And so running your own nodes is great to understand the technology. I do it myself, but then I also use the big box providers too. Like I use Infura, sure. Infura has a great resource, and devs are going to have to be devs basically like Hex Live. I mean, he understands like there's a lot of reasons to use Infura because they have some middleware that you can't even, you can't run yourself. They have some great event caching software and stuff. There's reason to use them. Um, I'm just monitoring them and look at the privacy policies, right? And just see, are you okay with the information they have?
So
It's
Gam,
based.
so Gamma, can I just jump in real quick? And like, I do think, so you make great points, and we can certainly talk about setting up your own node and stuff and get into that for the geek freaks. But like, as a layman person, you're a regular Joe Schmo, you would say it's inherently safer to actually use a big box VPN like NordVPN or something. Even though they say they're no log alternatives and they collect your information and they would give it over to authorities if requested, but they are inherently safer. You would recommend using them.
Yes, I use Proton Mail myself. But yeah, I mean, there's uses for a VPN. Like the primary use I use for a VPN isn't to hide my IP address. I don't care. They have it already. The government already has my IP address. They know where I live. It's to protect my local network. Say if I go to an airport or if I go to a Starbucks, I'm using a VPN to encrypt the data that I'm sending over the local network to the outside network. Like that's why I use a VPN. I don't use it to mask my IP address because I want to protect the data flowing on side of an internal network that's public because I don't know who's in those networks monitoring my data. And that's outside of IP address masking, which is what we're talking about.
Got
So
it.
on the tech note, let's say that you're not all the way nerdy like Gamma and Hex Live and some of these guys. Maybe let's look at this almost from a level of just like say community drive. So if as a community, if people are willing to run and set up nodes, such as maybe not yourself, I know that you've got a lot of big picture things that you're running and doing. But let's say, for example, that a group of us do want to say run a node, right? Let's say I want to set up a node. How I know that it depends on some of the hardware. Can you just kind of briefly speak to say, hey, if somebody wants to set up a node, can they set up a node and say have 8 to 10 people using that node? Can you go over some of say, I want to run a node for a group at a small level? Just touch on that briefly.
Oh, sure. Yeah. You can have, so you could go to AWS or you can go to DigitalOcean. These are, basically two big box providers for servers that I use. You can set up a server that costs about $150 a month, 16 gigs of RAM, 750 gigs of hard drive space. That's like SSD, so it's fast SSD. Not like it doesn't even do the fastest. You run the beacon chain, which is the beacon chain is the blockchain that if they're like say Ethereum uses to monitor all the validators, to keep track of who's a validator, who's not, and also to keep track of that. And then you have a second database, which is say Geth, even those other ones that keep tracks of contracts and account balances and that kind of stuff, keeping it at like a higher level. So those two clients, you install them through a very simple process that I actually outlined last week in video basically. It takes like a week for it to sync up. I'm actually 4 days into syncing my demo full node, and it's still going. It's taking forever. But you could have 10 people easy run off of one server that costs like $150 a month, and as long as you know who's running it, then they're not collecting your IP address or sharing it with anybody, or you can be pretty much assured if an individual is running a server, then that information isn't being collected or shared. You'd have to trust them, but if you're talking to them, it's probably pretty easy. And you could easily have like 100 people run off of a server like that pretty easily.
Thanks for the
See, that
commentary.
I think
I
is
just want to.
interesting. Sorry, just real briefly. I think that that's something to as some of us are looking through some of these things, I think that that is an area that we could improve on. Is, of course, we can't all run nodes. Not all of us get to sit in here and hang out with Twitter Spaces and get to sit here and talk with Gamma and a lot of these big brains that we have. But I do think the idea of villages in some capacity with nodes makes a lot of sense, right? If as we get together in some of these groups, a lot of us have had a chance to meet up in person. There's these tight knit little communities. I do think that there is some value in decentralizing, broadening that node capacity there, being close with the technology, that idea of truly running these things as decentralization, taking a little responsibility and running these things again. If you're talking about communities, if we take every 100 people in crypto, one of us can run a node, especially if we take a little time. And I do think that's a great place to expand on. So again, maybe this is over a lot of our heads at this particular time. I do think that is a direction that a lot of us should go. That gets really back to like that Bitcoin Cash versus Bitcoin and wanting to people to be able to run nodes versus big blocks and some of that stuff. So I do think that is something that we should be a little more common, a little more talked about. I know it's not as sexy as number go up, but the group village take on RPC and nodes, I think is important. And then I'll hand it back over to you, Hexi.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's not as simple as just running the client, because there's obviously you have a domain, and then you have to do there's some other stuff that's there. But say you have 100 people, you have like the smartest tech dude who knows computers. He can learn that stuff. It's not hard. Like I literally could do a class in 20 minutes and tell you everything you need to know. Like it's really not that difficult if you know computers already.
So, Gail, what are the biggest challenges to running a node?
Knowing how to do Linux command line and following instructions and looking at the output when there's an error and understanding how dependencies work in installing software on a Linux system, basic configurations. I did a lot of trial and error when I set up my stuff, because I set up, like probably not everybody knows this, but for Pulse Chain, I set up an enterprise grade RPC basically in testing that I was going to use for Pulse Chain. So I had, it's like a cluster of servers down behind a load balancer that's rate limited and all this stuff, right? All these different technologies put together. Took me, a month or so to like kind of trial and error it. But if you're going to do it for like a number of people, you don't need to have it, that much. But it's just, if you can install Ethereum client and get it to work, then there's like a couple extra steps to make it so that, like, say, small group of people could use it on the internet. So that was like, you've already got like 80% there. And so there's an extra 20% probably that you'd need to go, which is actually pretty easy.
Sweet. I just want to thank some people for coming into the room. Hodpro we see in here. We see a lot of our regulars. I've seen K4K, Alsamac Jr., tons of people. Thanks everybody for showing up. Go out there and share the Twitter Spaces. Tweet, like it, share it. Try to get some more people, at least so they can come back and listen to the replay later. WaLLrus, you were talking about the ethos and how this is against a true DeFi. Could you expand on that and let us know where you were going with that when we talked earlier?
For sure. So I'm one that in general, I tend to sort of mix, some of my moral, ethical kind of choices on some of these things, because I think that every governing model basically breaks if we don't really care about the people around us, right? Like if we're truly just cutthroat, get it how you get it, pretty much everything breaks to some point. So when it comes to these things, again, if you listen to Gamma or you look up like Iran Contra, you listen to Hex Live, some of these things, at some point it just goes far, far beyond what any rational person can actually do, right? There's just only so much that some people can do. And so they tend to try to do things that make sense, right? Like we kind of see this with marketing and other things, right? If you're a girl and you dye your hair pink, some people, you're going to kind of show that you're like a little bit on the left, probably, right? And so we try to do things. We use symbolism and music, and we use, brand preference. We do all these things to sort of show what it is we like, to vote and do these things on a broad spectrum, because a lot of these things get really, really hard. And so when it comes to DeFi, if you took the time to learn how all this fake money works, and you've gone in here and you've listened to some of the influencers, and you're taking self-custody on, and you're doing all these things, that says you don't want to be tracked, that you want to be able to operate in things that are permissionless, that you're trying to do things in a decentralized, permissionless, trustless way the best you can. And so I take it a little bit personal. Triggered isn't a word that really, it's got so much connotation. I don't really like using it, but it is a bit triggering in sort of a true sense of the word, when there are companies who are going above and beyond, or not being as clear, or sort of mixing their words in some ways. And I'm glad that the Gamma cleaned, went through Dan's and a little more technical, and made why that made sense, because it didn't make sense to me. So I'm glad that he clarified that one. But looking at some of the privacy policy in Uniswap, if you took the time to, again, to go through these services, to even learn what an RPC is, learn that the word infura actually means something, there's a good chance you were trying to do these things in a decentralized, permissionless, trustless way. And so it does feel a little bit like a betrayal when these guys go above and beyond compliance to try to run some of these things. And that's where I have the issue is, and I think Hex Live kind of hit it on the head, right? If somebody like Gamma wants to really take the time, he can really go through these things, and I can to some degree, not to the same caliber as Gamma, but we can push the edge of the envelope into what it is we can do to really stop things from being tracked. But the average user cannot, right? The average user doesn't understand half the lingo, that a guy like Gamma can use to get into. I've been blessed to be in some smaller groups, and hear him talk in other ways. That's part of where my concern is. One is, of course, there are things we can do to sort of limit some of these things, but I do have a problem that we even have to in the first place, because every time we do these things, we raise the barrier of entry to use these things the way we intended, right? You already can't use exchanges. You have to go through the time of learning self-custody. You already have to go through and learn that, all the things we talk about. There's nonces if you're trying to use multi-sig. There's limit orders. There's gasless spends. There's ways to use asymmetrical liquidity. Like, this stuff is very difficult to interact with at a certain level. And every time there's a barrier added that we sort of have to go on, things like hardware wallets, we make it more and more difficult, and there's less people who can participate the way they choose to. So sort of some of my arguments around some of these things aren't that I can't personally get around them or solve some of these issues, but I want the most amount of people to be able to engage with crypto and DeFi the way they would like to, right? So if you want to run nodes and do cool stuff, awesome. If you want to just sort of come here and take away some of the intrinsic issues with fiat, you should be able to do that at a reasonable level. And that's what I try to do with a lot of the things that I try to personally communicate is I want more people to use these things the way they want to, the way they intended to. And things like having to go through VPNs and double check RPCs really, again, raises that barrier to making these things like very functional for a lot of people, in my opinion.
Joseph, I saw that you had requested the mic, but then when I went in to go approve it, you dropped off. Go ahead and request it again if you have a question. And anybody else that has a question, feel free to request the mic. I did see one on Twitter, so either out to Gamma or WaLLrus. Question was from HEXpest. So from an OPSEC point of view, if you're using a VPN whenever going online to transact, there is no immediate concern of having your wallet and IP address linked, correct?
No, but you have a problem. You could potentially have leakage. It depends on, say, if you're going to use your wallet, but you don't always have a VPN connected because nobody has their VPN always connected. If you're not connected to the VPN and then you connect to MetaMask, you turn on your browser, now your IP address is being leaked to whoever's connected to it. So you got to be cognizant of that. Because although you're masking your IP address with a VPN, maybe if you don't start the VPN before you connect to all those services, then your IP address is going to be leaked to them because you're not behind the VPN all the time. So that would just be cognizant of that.
Good to know. Nobody likes leakage, so everybody wants to be secure in that aspect. WaLLrus, is there anything else we're leaving out that needs to be addressed here?
Yeah, I think those were the bigger concerns. And again, I'm glad we had Gamma to kind of come in and point to some of those things. And there's a lot of research that I think a lot of people are doing. You brought up like Sentinel, some of the decentralized like VPN type services. I genuinely I'm trying to dig through some of this stuff. And again, as you can see with when you hear some of these people speak, just I brought this up before. When it comes to like physics and some of those things, they talk about the weirdness of the big and the small. So like we're used to like gravity and just sort of general physics that we all kind of understand, right? Like heat dispersion, just basic stuff. But if you start talking about like physics on like the scale of like planets, and all of a sudden the math gets so weird, things stop to make sense, and you start getting bending around black holes and like the math just stops making sense. And then if you get really, really small and you get to like subatomic particles, and you get to like quarks and some of those things, like they can be in two places at the same time and never been in the middle, like the math just stops making sense, right? And I see that we got some people requesting, so we'll try to get these guys up here. But that's sort of where we're at with some of these things, is that we're all looking at sort of this middle ground that I think we can all kind of use and understand. But quickly, if you go just a step or two below, it gets very technical and difficult to read through. And if you go a step above, again, the same thing. You just sort of have this difficulty when it comes to really making some of these decisions at a high level and deciding between some of these things. So it can be very tricky. It's difficult.
Brandon from Millionaire Moon, what do you got to add, bro? You're on mute. You might not know we even added him. Gamma, do you have anything else you'd like to add or talk about?
Myself, no, I just take all questions. I didn't come here with an agenda. I came in here just to answer whatever you guys want to talk about.
No worries. WaLLrus, I don't see Funding Jim requesting the mic on my end. If you see him, Nas, can you add him? Oh, there he is.
Yeah, it's a little tricky.
Funding
We're
Jim,
trying to
welcome.
get some of these guys up.
Funding Jim, if you're in, go for it.
Hey guys, you able to hear me? I guess you can. I don't know about the popping on my microphone.
Yes, sir.
I try and keep it away from iPhone is sometimes good and sometimes bad. So it's very interesting. I just heard a bit of the conversation. I'm gonna hopefully this is replay and I'll play more of it later. I heard about like the barriers as far as the technical barriers of all the different things, whether it's VPNs, understanding tokenomics, economics of supply demand, the speculation element of FOMO or FUD, as far as our psychology of participating in this kind of asset. What do you think is actually useful? Do you think it's useful that something is valued because it is difficult to acquire, like diamonds out of a volcano or gold out of a mountain, things like that? And because it's difficult, it's less likely people sell after they acquire, like they've gone through the struggle, so to speak, or they've gone through the learning curve of having something that was valuable and then it was lost through hack or neglect or something along those lines? Or do you think that it's better that everybody, as simple as pushing, downloading an app on a Google or Apple store and hitting, two buttons in order to quote unquote buy with fiat and hold it somehow? Like, do you think that it's better to make everything super crazy easy, or do you think that the difficulty thing has value?
Yeah, I think that's a great framing. I'm very much agree that I think that those things should have a scale, and they should weigh out, right? When you look at any of that kind of like that Pareto distribution, where you get to the end of the spectrum, where there's the elites, the greats, the hardest workers on these things. So what I think is important is making sure that curve between someone who does nothing, someone who does something, and then someone who does everything at an elite level, that sort of makes sense, right? So I would hope that we can get to these things to where, as you said, as simple as a click of a button, moving some fiat, they're able to at least remove some of the counterparty risk that goes around being in fiat, especially in more affected countries where they can just use these things in some functional way at a reasonable level. And then if they're willing to do things, again, a lot of the stuff that we participate in, understanding, spending some time in spaces, using limit orders, if you're into the charting and TA stuff, I'm personally not, that those people end up having a higher result, right? Better results, better decision making, able to extract more of that value. And then if you get to the people who spend all the time and energy and build great things and educate others and, focus and are asymmetrical in their efforts, that they have the highest end of that distribution, that they get the best results. So I do think there should be a difference, but I think it's one of those that a fair playing field doesn't mean that everybody comes out the same, but that the output adequately reflects the input between most of those users. So I do think it's a scale for sure.
Brandon,
Yeah,
I see your hands up. I know you've been patiently waiting. Oh, sorry, Funding Jim. If you
No.
just want to finish up, and then Brandon, you can go next. Or Gamma. Sorry, Gamma was speaking there.
No, I was going to say that, in cryptocurrency, I believe the opportunity now is why the gains are, you know what I mean? It's that simple concept of, because it's hard to do it now, and then over time it'll be less difficult in the future as more people get on board. It's kind of related to network effects. And then it's also like knowledge base, the people who can get in now, who can put the effort in now to understand the technology, to understand how to use a wallet from a basic understanding. And then as more people come in later, the opportunities get decreasing over time. But that's why we have the opportunity now, right? If we're willing to put in the effort now to understand it and get in, and then also maybe get put in the understanding to not get scammed and have better security and all this stuff that goes along with it.
Makes total sense. Brandon, you can go, and then Funny Jim, if you want to follow up after him, you can go.
Yeah, perfect. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay,
Sounds
right
good.
on. Yeah, so guys, I was hoping to maybe widen a bit the circle of worry here because, look, I've recently been running in some traditional finance circles, and I was particularly unsettled with the degree of comfort I saw these traditional guys having in the idea of decentralized exchanges being a thing of the past, in the future being all centralized exchanges basically controlled by Fidelity and BlackRock down the road. So I just want to say that, DeFi is under attack on multiple fronts. And one narrative that's kind of gone under the wire here, something that we haven't really been considering much as a community is, we saw what happened with things like Tornado Cash and privacy when it comes to swapping. But I think, folks, there's a large contingent out there brewing against decentralized exchanges themselves. And I think this stems a lot from the Bitcoin community having gotten used to essentially only being able to transact on centralized exchanges. But I think this is going to be more and more of an issue moving forward as regulation comes into this space. I think they're going to start coming after DEXs, folks. Look, I heard these traditional finance guys talking about this, and it scared the shit out of me. And I think it's an issue that's going to become bigger and bigger in the coming years.
Yeah, that's some great points there. Everybody's worried about regulation and people getting comfortable that DEXs are going to be the way of the past. That's kind of scary coming from legacy guys, but they're also legacy guys, so take it with a grain of salt, right? Funny Jim, do you want to add on?
Yeah, so real quick, just before you just to interrupt, these were traditional finance guys getting to the crypto space with lots of money and even worse influence as well. So just that little, yeah, that's what I have to say.
Noted.
Yeah, the comment I was going to make was about the difficulty thing. Like, I think that once things become simple and very easy, then people that have a speculative, entrepreneurial, risk-taking, looking for higher ROI, we're always going to look for the more complex Rube Goldberg machine to figure out. Like, there are certain people that really get into Linux and operating systems, and they really want to know the granular details about everything that's happening in technology. When most people just want to hit a GUI button, an icon, and have their thing perform for them. So, like, it's interesting that in a speculative nature, if it's difficult to find, a particular gemstone, then it becomes more valuable. because fewer people are looking for it, but the reward is high. I don't know. It's just like I'm learning more about like psychology and stuff like that. And even when you come from like real estate and you're expecting 5 to 10% cap in order to make profit, that's like very predictable kind of numbers. And the astronomical numbers of crypto to me is not just because you're early, but because you do go through some of that learning curve. And the barrier to entry is higher than just hitting a GUI button. It's interesting. I think we'll always try and find more difficulty, though. I don't think that there's ever going to be a grandma. It's so easy for grandma, and she has returns that are anything above inflation anyway.
Yeah, there's definitely a fine line there, because you want things to be easy to increase adoption, but like that's a great point. Like you want it to be like a fine gem and hard to find, so that does make it more valuable as well. Jesse, I saw you request the mic. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, that's like to add to what Funding Jim just said, and what you've said. This is just how life works. Look, if you want to be secure, the ultimate security is difficult. Easy security comes in the form of, centralized places that are there to make life easy for you. But the most robust security is hard, and you got to do it yourself. The biggest gains in crypto, you're going to typically find when you do things the hard way. When you find the decentralized exchanges, the coins, the things that are hard to get, hard to find before the exchanges pick them up, that's where the biggest gains come from. The easy things that the exchanges carry, well, they come typically with the least amount of gains. And this is literally just the way of the world. I do think that DeFi is under attack by centralized exchanges, but I also think that centralized exchanges are under attack by DeFi. What's interesting there is you can't really stop DeFi. Right, there's no way to stop it. All it takes is, one guy like Gamma to spool up a node somewhere, and we connect into it, with VPN or with Tor or whatever, and we continue doing what we've always done. But then on the other hand of this, how do you get your money out, right? So if you're in crypto, we're all still reliant on some sort of off ramp at the end of the day, and that's the scary part, right? The central point of failure in all of crypto is once you do whatever it is that you're doing in DeFi land, what do you do next, right? You've got to send some crypto back to a centralized party, even if it's for a brief moment of time. And if there is a major attack on DeFi, they can just turn that light switch off, and then it's like, well, we can just never off ramp. That's the scary part. Until retail people start accepting crypto as a form of payment, that risk is always going to be there.
Great points and all valid concerns. Hodpearl, welcome to the mic.
Hi there. I decided to add to be a speaker just to kind of bring up the fact that Jesse was talking about Tor, and that it was a good idea to actually use Tor with another additional layer of security.
Yeah, that, as you guys have added, like you can keep chasing the rabbit and adding these layers of security. And I think that they are things that we need to sort of bring into the consciousness and make sure that as we discussed, the people who are willing to put in that work are sort of aware of where those things are, and they're able to keep building better and better things to where the sort of standard operating procedures get better and better in crypto. This is something this community does well, where they, again, like this is where we'll tease the Bitcoin guys, right? They typically come from a more TradFi standpoint. They don't have smart contracts, so they're not used and exposed to all this DeFi, and they have a bit of an echo chamber, right? And we have our own echo chamber as well, right? We probably don't give enough credit to some of the advantage of proof of work. We don't give enough advantages to, the node decentralization that goes on in Bitcoin. The fact that it's just the longest chain, right? There is some versions of, of that chain that do have, a superior security model, at least somewhere, right? So yeah, we prefer DeFi and we like building all the cool stuff we're doing. And it's important that we understand these things. You know, again, as we've looked at all these centralized exchanges fail, very few people in our communities were affected because we scream at the top of our lungs, to, not your keys, not your coins, to use hardware wallets, to use multi-sig. You know, now we're discussing this next front here. And even if we don't end up going all the way down the rabbit hole, hopefully at least understanding some of these things make sure that our community, you know, has their heads on a swivel. They're aware of when these things start to turn past the point, and that we're able to, you know, pivot into some of these things as far as maybe we do need to have more people running nodes at sort of a community level in these things, and that we're able to, again, stay in front of the issues and make sure that we're not a part of the next sort of centralized failure point. I think that's really what we're trying to get out of these spaces, is that there's to make sure that we're all aware that we're starting to sort of solve some of these problems at certain levels, and that we're prepared to make sure that we're always ahead of the curve. And we want to read the headlines and not be a part of them for the most part.
Speaking of headlines, I think it's kind of fascinating that I was looking at some crypto news, and I believe it was NBC. I could be wrong about this. It was actually talking about DeFi and how people are getting their currencies out of exchanges and into DeFi. And I thought it was so crazy to see a mainstream source have that sentiment, because it's usually always the other way around.
Yeah,
I
and
think
I
I saw
brought
an
it up that
article.
even that sorry there, Hexy. You know, I brought
No
up that
worries.
like Brazil was another country that had just added BTC as you know, as legalizing it for general payments and things like that. So we can quickly get wrapped up in just, you know, sort of reading whatever the SEC is picking on next, or like the you know, the EU bank and things like that. But and I'm not even saying anyone should necessarily go to Brazil. I'm just bringing it up as another country, another place where we're starting to see that expansion into using more of these tools, using more of the DeFi space. You know, we see it in Dubai and the Emirates. You know, Thailand is opening up a lot of programs for like digital nomads. We're seeing there's a few other places that, you know, allow you to like, you know, purchase citizenship, and through, again, it gets a little more specific there, but it'll basically allow you to do that value in crypto. So we're, as much as we're seeing sort of doomsday headlines and sort of the local news, or like, you know, again, it's things that are associated with just the US jurisdiction, there's more and more places opening up, and there's more and more places that'll always sort of fill the gap in when it comes to building DeFi and people wanting to operate in the space and take their value somewhere else.
Well, I think that's a really good point you made there, and we're coming up a little over an hour. Unless there's anything else you think we need to talk about, WaLLrus, do you think this is a good spot to end it?
Yeah, we can open up to any final questions and comments.
Yeah, I've got a comment about decentralization. It's so interesting to say, not your keys, not your coins, and it's a pretty easy concept. You know, if an exchange has the seed phrases or private keys, look, they can do whatever they want with crypto. You, on the other hand, if you have your own seeds, your own private keys, that's your crypto. And nobody can touch that unless you interact with a bad contract and authorize somebody to take that from you, right? So that's easy enough concept, but it goes deeper than that. It's like, if it's not your server, it's not your data. If you have any information stored on a centralized server, your name, your documents, whatever you decided to store on that server or send through that server, resides on hard drives somewhere in a company that has thousands of employees. And just like you see in crypto, where bad things happen, you see all the time in centralized data storage places where people just run off with the data. There's data breaches, they just take your stuff, right? So like this whole concept of decentralization, there are places that are trying to forge the way ahead to make things a little safer, not segregated in one single point of failure. IPFS is an example of that. Tor is another example of that, where there are technologies out there outside of crypto to also decentralize your data. And if we're always going to harp on not your keys, not your coins, we should also take the same stance about our other data besides our crypto keys.
Yeah, I agree. And, I talk a lot about too, essentially the same way you're saying to, that we have this aspect of self-sovereignty and decentralization when it comes to actual custody with data. There's a lot of those things. You can have if you have all your assets locked up in one jurisdiction, you can be subject to just jurisdictional risk. If you don't have other residencies, if you don't have a lot of plans for decentralization in other ways, then you can, again, as we've seen recently, lose your freedom of movement. Your freedom of speech can be restricted. There's a lot that I think goes into some of those decentralizations. If you really want to use these things as a way to protect your way of life and your family and these things, there's a lot to learn. It can be a lot, but I think taking on that responsibility gives you a unbelievable amount of resources and opportunity to have a much more direct impact on your surroundings. There's a lot of people that are standing up here, or people who don't even have the mic down here, who have made outsized differences in people's lives because how much these things scale, right? Whether it's people just putting out content on YouTube, whether it's people actually building some of these applications, whether it's education at some of these levels, running spaces, people find a way to really use some of this tech in a way that scales. And when you're able to do those things, usually you can take advantage of that in other ways. And there's a great number of things you can do to really have a big impact on the world and sort of directly what it is that you experience by taking advantage and taking responsibility for a lot of these things, which I think is what a lot of decentralization and self-custody really comes down to, is not wanting to defer that responsibility to centralized powers.
Great take. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in today. We're just going to wrap it up. We're just trying to keep these to about an hour or so. Big thank you out to Gamma. Thank you for coming on and providing your insights about the nodes and all the IP issues and security. Thank you to WaLLrus as always. Thank you to all the guests who hopped on to request the mic and ask questions, both on Twitter Spaces and on the YouTube comments. Be sure to go out there and follow me, HEXiCAT, with an underscore before and after on Twitter, and subscribe to the HEXiCAT Chats podcast powered by Liquid Loans. Go to our YouTube channel. Check out Matt on there. He's always putting out new content. Also, make sure to go follow all the other social media that Liquid Loans has for Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Reddit, and especially go to the Telegram groups. That's the fastest way to get all your information and questions answered. And also, reminder, the DApp is still live on testnet. So if you haven't played with it yet, go out and check it out, play with it, get used to it. Just like PulseX, make sure you are ready for when all this stuff goes live so you know what you're doing. Thank you to everybody for stopping by, and we will see you on the next Liquid Lunch.
Great. Appreciate it.
Thanks again, Gamma.